Okay, so we just saw ovulation happen in the ovaries. Now we are ready to look at what happens during the luteal phase. Okay, so we're going to start with the beginning of the luteal phase, the early to mid luteal phase. What happens during this phase is that hormones from the corpus luteum, so these are the hormones, particularly progesterone, but also we have estrogen and inhibin. Those hormones are going to provide negative feedback on GnRH, FSH, and LH secretion. Okay, so I have this question for you here. What is the effect of that on follicles and follicle development? So think about that for a little bit. Okay, so hopefully you remember that in the follicular phase, we had our FSH and LH stimulating follicle development. Here, since we are not getting FSH and LH secretion, or at least we're greatly down regulating it, we are not stimulating follicle development. Okay. And the idea here is that we just ovulated, right? So we just released an egg. That egg might get fertilized and give rise to an embryo. Okay. Um, if that's going to happen, we don't want to be getting new follicles ready for potential fertilization at this point. Okay. So that's kind of the idea here. We don't want to be recruiting new follicles when we just released an egg and we might be getting pregnant. Okay. I just want to mention that birth control pills mimic the effect of progesterone, mimic the actions of progesterone. So a lot of birth control pills are progesterone related compounds. Sometimes they also have some estrogens in them. But basically what happens is we suppress FSH and LH production. We do not get follicle development. We do not get ovulation in the presence of birth control pills. Okay. All right, so that was what happens in the ovaries. Now let's take a look at what happens in the uterus during the early to mid luteal phase. Remember, we have progesterone being made by the corpus luteum along with our other hormones, estrogen and inhibin, but let's just focus on the progesterone. That progesterone from the corpus luteum is going to stimulate the uterus to become a secretory structure, or the endometrium of the uterus to become a secretory structure. What does it mean to become a secretory structure? Basically, the cells they start to secrete things, right? So they form glands. They increase their surface area so that they can provide more secretions, and they start to secrete materials such as proteins, lipids, and glycogen in order to nourish the potential embryo that's going to be coming to the uterus. Okay, so we just saw the events of the early to mid luteal phase. Now let's take a look at the late luteal phase. So what happens during the late luteal phase is that in the absence of a pregnancy, if we do not get pregnant, the corpus luteum dies off after 2 weeks. So 2 weeks after ovulation, the corpus luteum kind of disintegrates. Okay. I would like you to think about the effect of that on these factors here. So progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin levels. What is the effect on the endometrium? What is the effect on gonadotropin levels? Remember, gonadotropins are LH and FSH. And then think about what the results of these changes would be in the uterus and in the ovaries. So go ahead, definitely you need to pause here. And when you're ready, you can come back. Okay, so the results of the corpus luteum dying are actually shown in the next couple slides. They are the cause of the late luteal phase. Okay, so looking at the ovaries, what we have is with the corpus luteum dying and getting a drop in estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin levels, that is going to lift the negative feedback that we had on GnRH, FSH, and LH production. Okay, so without that negative feedback, we are now free again to make FSH and LH. And as a result, we are going to stimulate the development of new follicles. So basically, we are ending the menstrual cycle and re-entering the next menstrual cycle. So we're re-entering the follicular phase by recruiting new follicles, okay? In the case of a pregnancy, the corpus luteum does not die and completely different series of events happen. We're going to talk about that later, okay? But in this case, what we're considering is the case of no pregnancy. Okay, so the other main effect of having the corpus luteum die off and losing those hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin, is that we get menses in the uterus. So just kind of to walk you through why that is, remember that the reason we were in the secretory phase here in the endometrium was that we had progesterone stimulating secretion by the endometrium. When the corpus luteum dies, we lose that progesterone, so we lose that stimulation to maintain the endometrium as a secretory structure. Okay, so without progesterone, the endometrium can no longer be sustained. So what happens is blood vessels start to contract, the cells are going to die from lack of nourishment. And then that basically causes us to re-enter menses. So we go back to the beginning of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so in the ovaries, we are able to recruit new follicles because our corpus luteum died. In the uterus, we are re-entering menses because our corpus luteum died. And overall, that causes us to re-enter or restart the menstrual cycle overall. Okay, so that pretty much closes our discussion of the menstrual cycle. I just want to close by showing you this figure from your book that summarizes all of the events of the menstrual cycle. So you can see the ovarian cycle here, the events of the ovarian cycle. You can see the events of the uterine cycle here. You can see what is happening with the gonadotropin levels, LH and FSH, as well as the hormones that we have coming from the ovaries. And then finally, I just want to mention, you can see body temperature changes as well. So this is something that I did not talk about really, but progesterone actually causes a slight elevation of body temperature. So you see that in the luteal phase.